In an interview, Anne Applebaum once said, "Nothing is set in stone. We can change history every day. Everything that happens tomorrow depends on what we do today." And I would like to open this event with your quote. With the attack on Ukraine, Russia has not only violated international law, it has also deeply shaken the European security and peace order. This war marks an historic turning point. The world, as we knew it, is no longer the same. The attack on the post-war order in Europe represents a grave violation of the principles that have ensured stability on the European continent for decades, particularly the agreement that borders must not be changed by force. We, the Goethe Institute, the Ukrainian Institute, and the Mistevsky Arsenal, we are deeply honored to welcome to today's discussion the renowned historian Anne Applebaum, the Ukrainian foreign minister from 2020 to 2024, Dmytro Kuleba, and the journalist Cathrin Kahlweit.
Thank you.
And together, I think you can applause. And together we will discuss what the world might look like after the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. I'm very honored to have the two of you here. You're hard to get. Mrs. Applebaum, as you all know, will get the Friedenspreis des Deutschen Buchhandels on Sunday, and she has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize as well for her Gulag book, and is at the moment on very many stages and podiums because of her newest book, Autocracy, Inc., that she gets, amongst other books, the Friedenspreis for. It's about dictators who want to rule the world and deals with repression and with corruption and with kleptocracy and propaganda. She's at the moment maybe one of the most influential intellectual voices in the current public discourse because of her books and because of her writings for The Atlantic, where she's a staff writer, and for all the other media that she writes for Washington Post, New York Times, you may name it, and for podcasts. And I very much advise you to listen to the newest one with Peter Pomerantsev about autocracy in America if you want to learn something about the upcoming elections. She's publicized, as I said, about the Gulag and about Ukraine, about Holodomor and history of Russia and Ukraine, about propaganda, and very many current topics that we have to deal with and that threaten our world as we know it today. She's born in the US and has worked for some time as well in the UK, working for The Spectator, I think, and in many other European places. I will spare you because you know her, and we have not that much time. The only thing that is important to say, when she's not traveling around working like a dog, she spends half of her time, I hope at least, with her family in Poland, because she's married to Radek Sikorski, the foreign minister, and has, not to talk about that, she's written a Polish cookbook, amongst other things, which Dmytro Kuleba is at the moment doing as well, writing a Ukrainian cookbook. So we're looking forward to that. He was the foreign minister of Ukraine from March 22 to September 24, when he, how do I put that, resigned in a government reshuffle, and is son of a diplomat and studied international relations in Kiev, had a steep career in foreign service, squeezed in a PhD, and has been working since as a key figure for the Ukraine's effort to fight off Russia's full-scale invasion, traveling across the world to secure allies and mobilize support for Ukraine. When he resigned, the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, said he always puts the people of his country above himself. I think everybody was very sad when you walked away from that office. So our topic today is, how will the world look like after the war in Ukraine? We will not manage to solve that question in 45 minutes, but Mrs. Applebaum, I would like to start with the question that refers to one article that you wrote in The Atlantic just recently. The title of that article is "The Only Way the Ukraine War Can End, ? Russia has to stop fighting." Can you, in very rough terms, outline how on earth that could happen?
So, First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Frankfurt, and it's also a real pleasure to be with Dmytro Kuleba, who I've known, I think, since before the war. I had lunch with him in Kiev in December of 2021, when we were speculating about whether there would be a war, and I've followed him and been talking to him ever since, and so I'm glad he's here today. Yes, I'll repeat what I said in the article. So this war is over when the Russians recognize that Ukraine is an independent and sovereign country, and when they make a political decision that it is not worth fighting anymore to destroy it and to occupy it. They can come to that conclusion in different ways. They can do so through the military victory of the Ukrainians, through even a few important symbolic defeats, some of which they've suffered already. They can come to that conclusion because of economic pressure and the impending failure of their economy. They have a labor shortage, they have a financial imbalance, their companies are having difficulty trading since they can no longer access dollars or euros. So they can come to that conclusion for that reason, or they can come to that conclusion for internal political reasons, because the specter of a 2.5-year war that was supposed to last for 3 days, Kiev was supposed to be conquered in 3 days, and the rest of the country in 6 weeks, turned out to be far from true. And there are many people inside the military and security apparatus who know it, and who know what a failure this has been for the Russian army and for the Russian security forces. So I don't think it's at all incredible to imagine that Russia would decide to recognize Ukraine and end the war, because it's very much in Russia's national interests. It's in the interests of the Russian people. It's in the interests of Russian business and Russian economy to end the war. And sooner or later, they will come to that conclusion. Russia's resources are not infinite. The fact that they need ammunition from North Korea, they seem to be importing soldiers from North Korea, they need ammunition from Iran, that shows they've already reached the outer limits of what they are able to produce. And so it's very, very important that we continue to support Ukraine and to achieve that, to achieve the victory that will end the war. Let me just say something, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what negotiations and diplomacy might mean. One way or the other, there will be negotiations at the end of this war. It will end with some kind of diplomatic agreement, okay? But until the Russians have mentally come to the conclusion that the war will not be won and they will not conquer Ukraine, there will be no meaningful negotiations. You could have a temporary ceasefire, but that wouldn't prevent the war from starting again in 2 years' time. The meaningful end of the war requires this political change in Russia, which I say could come out in various ways. There's a lot right now of kind of wishful thinking, and also, people say they're tired. We're tired of the war. We want it to be over. Believe me, and I think Dmytro will agree with this, Ukrainians are also tired of the war and want it to be over. But coming to a ceasefire or an end which does not result in a stable and sovereign Ukraine will not bring peace to Europe, and will not allow us to think about something else. If Russia were to conquer Ukraine, the cost for us would be higher. We would have to pay more money. It would be more expensive. We would have a greater security problem. We would have a greater refugee problem. We would have greater sources of violence and unrest inside Europe. So the end of the war that is not a Ukrainian victory is not a success or a solution or a peaceful end for us either.
Mr. Kuleba, taking that into consideration, and sticking for a moment with Russia, when I walk around Kiev and talk to politicians and strategists, it most of the time sounds, sorry if I'm simplifying, as if the only thing that really matters is Western support. And that obviously there's no time to wait for the Russian government to crumble, but as if the only existential answer to end this war, or solution to end this war, is Western pressure. Is that right?
Well, first, thank you for having us here and giving me the luxury of sitting at the same panel with Anne. Congratulations with the prize, by the way. I think the core, the solution to the victory always lays inside of you. And then you add up additional elements to what makes you stronger. But first and foremost, you yourself have to be strong. And this applies to Ukraine. So first we have to do our homework, and we've done a lot. Second, we have to believe in victory. And third, we need to be able to permanently convince partners to continue standing by us. Unfortunately, I still have to say that we have to convince, because while people share the wish for Ukraine to remain a sovereign and independent state, we always hear complaints on how difficult the assistance gets. It is very weird to hear from the richest and the most influential part of the world, which is called the collective West, irrespective of where geographically these countries are located, that we are short of money, we are short of patience, because you have the money, and you have to realize that if we do not win the war, you, as Anne rightly said, you will have to pay a much higher check. Because if anyone believes that Putin will win in Ukraine and say, Ukraine was everything I wanted, that person does not understand neither Putin nor the entire Russian machine. What else is at stake here? If Russia loses the war, it will be the end of the Russian imperial project. If Ukraine loses the war, it will be the end of Ukrainian statehood. And for Europe, if Ukraine and the rest of the world, if Ukraine wins the war, it will mean peace and prosperity for years to come. Because Russia will not be driven by imperial thinking anymore. But if Russia wins the war, then Europe will have to face the conflict with Moscow. And actually, it's the German officials, to their credit, who started making this, military officials, who were the first in Western Europe to begin talking about the possibility of a direct conflict between Russia and NATO. So the understanding of this is brewing among generals, among intelligence, but we need to set this message clear to the wider audience so that people understand what is at stake in this war.
Exactly, it's brewing amongst generals, amongst military people, but nevertheless, the humanitarian aid is not enough. The financial support is dwindling, partially because people like Orban are trying to prevent conditional help even to be paid. Weapons are delivered either too late or too little. That promise from the West, whatever it takes, the support, whatever it takes, how long as it takes, was that something like a premature exaggeration?
I'm not sure it was an exaggeration. I mean, I think it was the wrong formula.
Okay.
Whatever it takes, how long it takes.
Would you know a better one?
Yeah, I mean, the formula should have been from the beginning, whatever it takes to win. And the idea of winning and the idea of victory were very often left out of
exactly, which is a point.
Both American and German language about the war from the beginning, and I think that was a mistake. Because thinking, you can't win unless you plan to win. And we didn't really plan to win at the beginning of the war.
That's exactly why I'm asking, because, I mean, you're a diplomat by heart and by profession, but what Mrs. Applebaum just said is the point. Scholz talked about a Zeitenwende. Was that over before it ever began because the concept of winning was not included?
A year and a half ago, the European Union made a public commitment to deliver 1 million artillery rounds to Ukraine.
Didn't come.
and even half of it did not arrive on time, while Russia started receiving the artillery ammunition from North Korea. And I made the public comment, which made some German officials feel outraged about me, because I said that North Korea seems to be a more reliable partner to Russia than European countries to Ukraine. I was accused of polarizing with friends, but you have to polarize with friends when your life is at stake, because true friends will understand. And this is the test for real friendship. And for what exactly people mean under these words, as long as it takes. Because Anne is absolutely right. In every meeting that I had with US and European officials, I was telling them from the very beginning, guys, I mean, it's a buzzword, it sounds very nice, but it misses the end, it lacks the ending. You have to define the purpose. What are you trying to achieve? As long as you do not have the purpose and you just want to be nice and helpful, we're not going to win. But this is a constant dialogue that you have to have with your friends. And we all remember where Germany started with its military support and how many conflicts we had. And now Germany is number one after the United States in providing Ukraine with military assistance. We are not asking for more because we are greedy and we believe that someone else's pockets are endless. We are asking for more because the whole concept of the West is based on the idea that promises should be fulfilled. And they must, in this particular case, they must be fulfilled not only in the interest of Ukraine, but in the interest of Europe as a whole. And I will repeat again and again, for Europeans and for Americans, the check for Russia fighting directly against you on your land will be much higher, way higher than the check of supporting Ukraine.
Two questions for you. One question, that polarization that you talked about. At the moment, one reason for that is the debate about long-range missiles. Long-range missiles, you know, that being able to strike goals within Russia. Why is it so difficult to convince the West of something that seems obvious as being helpful and useful and necessary, unless we have to talk about red lines, whatever they are, and how we have to define them?
And I want to be sympathetic to President Biden, actually, who I think has done an enormous amount for Ukraine. He created an international coalition that didn't exist before. He's been personally dedicated to the war effort. He went to Ukraine in the middle of the war, which was pretty unprecedented was unprecedented for an American president to go into a war zone without, when there are no American troops there. Having said all that, he is somebody who comes from a generation for whom the threat of nuclear war and the fear of what that meant was the defining idea of world politics.
But sorry to interrupt, he's not the only one who's saying no.
No, I know. But many of these decisions are dependent on the United States. I mean, for example, the German decision to eventually to send these tanks, the main battle tanks, to Ukraine, was made after the U.S. did. So the U.S. decision matters a great deal. And Biden has had this idea of himself as the person who is preventing nuclear war since the beginning of the war. And you know, at each phase, he's worried about provocation. And sometimes the Russians very directly use language about nuclear war in order to prevent this or that tactic or weapon from being used. I mean, I think it's become pretty clear since the war began that this is a tactic, that this is part of Russia's information war, to frighten people, to prevent, to get us to deter ourselves, to prevent the Western world from using what it can to end the war, to achieve victory and end the war. We know, for example, now that those threats were very important in the autumn of 2022, which is a moment when Ukraine was winning and taking back territory, that the U.S. became worried about the consequences of victory right about then. And, in retrospect, this was a disastrous mistake. So, so this is the explanations are, they give different explanations. Sometimes they're technical ones, but the basic problem is this fear of what the Russians would do. I mean, I would say, look, the Russians are escalating all the time. They're escalating in Ukraine. They're escalating their attacks on civilians in Ukraine. I mean, they now hit targets that are, there's no pretense of hitting battlefield targets. They hit cities, they hit power plants, they hit schools and hospitals, and they do it regularly as a part of their policy. They're also now engaged in a pretty widespread campaign of sabotage in Europe. I mean, so far there's been no huge catastrophe, fortunately, but there are multiple small examples of Russian sabotage, whether it's a murder in the center of Berlin, whether it's a train in France. And they're escalating this constantly. They're also escalating their aid for the Iranians in the Middle East, and they're escalating in other ways as well. And we seem to be allowing them to make the decision. They're determining what escalation means.
Exactly, and that would have been my next question. Thank you, because that war in the gray zone, let's put it like that. I don't like the wording hybrid war. We seem to be taking that, as it comes. The reaction isn't very strong. Maybe it's ignorance. Maybe we still are not understanding what's happening there. So part of what Russia is doing here is this war in the gray zone that Europe does not react to. Why?
It's very hard for Europe to see and understand Russia as a vital threat to its own interests. There's been 30 years of people being convinced that the Cold War is over and that means we don't have this problem anymore. And if people were to acknowledge and accept that it is a problem, not only, by the way, the war in Ukraine, but also sabotage, also information war, then that would require a really fundamental sea change in how we see the world and how politicians behave. And so far, most people, I shouldn't say everybody, but most countries are not willing to do it.
Would it also mean using the same means, probably illegal means, unfair means, unlucky means, in order to defend oneself? I mean, we're not used to that. The West.
I don't know what you mean by illegal or unfair means. I mean, we could certainly organize our own defense of our political systems better in a clear way. We could certainly be communicating better into Russia than we do now.
Okay.
We could be doing it more creatively. I mean, there are plenty of people experimenting with it, and thinking about how it could be done. And we could also be conducting the economic campaign in a more definitive way. I mean, there are a lot of holes in the sanctions regime. Yeah. I don't know if this audience knows, but the exports from Europe to Kazakhstan have tripled and quadrupled since 2022. But that's not because suddenly Kazakhstan is buying more things from Europe. It's because things are put in containers and they're marked Kazakhstan and they just don't get there. I mean, they end up in Russia. And the U.S. has some infrastructure to enforce sanctions. The European Union has very little. It's left up to the member states, and some of them do it and some of them don't. So we haven't been serious about this economic pressure yet either. And as Dmytro said, nor have we been as consistent in our military support as we believe we have either.
You're obviously right. I was talking about fighting their game, but there are other means, obviously, as you said, laws against kleptocracy, etc. Mr. Kuleba, when we look at that propaganda war, part of it is being fought in Germany at the moment. Since we are here in Germany, let's talk about that for a while. There's groups in German politics which are getting stronger, the AfD, Sarah Wagenknecht, who think that this war should be ended with Ukraine paying a high price. If you were to talk to Sarah Wagenknecht today, why would you tell her that this is a bad idea?
Well, I would simply express hope that she understands clear difference between campaigning and governing, because we've seen many times We've been through some cases when politicians, while campaigning, were advocating one position, but were becoming far more reasonable if they were to be elected. I mean, I do not prejudge the outcome of German elections or any other elections. But propaganda, every war starts with people who believe in something. And when we are discussing the question of why we have this, why the West still entertains this escalation policy, this non-escalation policy, and why the support has not been as consistent as it could be, we have to be very clear. And I have to be very clear, and I will try to add another angle to this discussion. The reason why the West behaves the way it does is partially because, as Anne rightly said, this is the generation that comes from the Cold War times, and they were grown in this kind of mental, political framework. In Germany, it's an additional, and there is an additional argument because you have a very long history of relations with Russia. You and Russia were happy in dividing Europe in halves. I mean, Central and Eastern Europe, we should always remember that. This is the doctrine, the philosophy that is always in the mindsets and in the pages. I don't have problems with that, it's all in the past, but I'm just making the point that people always believe in something. And the problem with the West is that it never believed in Ukraine. It did not believe in Ukraine before the war, it did not believe in Ukraine in the beginning of the war, and only when we survived those famous 3, 7, 10 days, whoever gave, different people gave us different timeline to die. But only when they saw that we survived, they started to believe in us. And we can endlessly criticize President Biden or Chancellor Scholz, but if President Biden was not the President of the United States of America in February 2022, Ukraine would not receive even the smallest part of support that we did. If Chancellor Scholz was not running the German government, together with his coalition partners, Germany would not be number 2 in supporting Ukraine. But it only came, this change came, when we defeated their disbelief in Ukraine. And now the same people do not believe that we can win. And this is why we have to keep fighting for this belief. And when you win the war for what people believe in, then decisions follow.
I have to continue on that depressive note because I wouldn't be a good journalist if I didn't ask about Zelensky's victory plan that he presented in Brussels and in Germany during the last days, because the response was not very overwhelming. How do I imagine that? Question to you, the two of you. Does he want like a treaty Eurolithium for our lithium for your jets, or your open door to NATO for our troops in NATO, or is this an idea that he wants to plant in European and American brains, but they don't want it to be planted? Is it fruitless?
Well, it's always better to have a plan than not to have one, right? Of course, every plan needs to be supported by the stakeholders. And with regard to this particular plan, it heavily relies on the position of partners. President Zelensky has many talents, and one of them is to shake up people, domestically and also internationally. And with this plan, he achieved the purpose, the goal, because he made people reflect. We will see what will come out of it. But the law of the war and the law of the propaganda war is always the same. You know, you have to come up with a narrative. You have to tell your story. You have to make others reflect on your proposal, on your story. If you make it the other way around, then you will always be responding to someone else's and fighting someone else's narrative. I don't know how it will end. I mean, this particular victory plan. He made the move. We heard first responses. But I think what is clear to everyone, and the message that President Zelensky is trying to convey, is that we can win together if certain things happen. To what extent these things will happen, that will be the issue of the real political decisions. But the message is out, and the process was kind of kicked off.
You know, it's also very important. I mean, it's not so much about NATO per se, but it's also true that the war needs to end with Ukrainians feeling some sense of security and having some ability to plan for the future. So that, you know, the war can't end in such a, you know, it won't have ended if the attacks might start up again next month or next year. If you want Ukrainian refugees to go home, and you want investors to build Ukraine, and you want, you know, you want to be able to have a normal country in which you open the borders and there's normal travel back and forth, and there are flights, you know, from Berlin and Frankfurt to Kiev and Lviv again, then you need this sense of security. So it's not wrong to be talking about or thinking about what that would look like at the end of the war. And because a war that ends with an insecure Ukraine will not create a stable Ukraine and will not create a stable situation. And remember, again, all these people, the Sarah Wagenecks and whoever who want to end the war or stop aiding Ukraine, and who are at the same time great enemies of refugees, you know, end the war the wrong way, and you will have 5 million more refugees.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, or?
No, I think everyone is overly focused on the NATO thing because it's a buzzword that everyone discusses. NATO, you know, Ukraine will be a member of the EU and NATO. It's just a matter of time and the price we are going to pay for that. But some people, they try to eat the cake piece by piece. But sometimes life works differently, you know, and you have to eat the whole cake. It's not healthy, but it tastes deliciously. So it's going to happen, because if you leave, I think this is what elites in Europe has finally recognized, that there must be no gray zones. And if you take Ukraine in the EU and you keep it out of NATO, there is a gray zone. It works only with both.
Maybe Zelensky read your book because he was talking about a possible world war coming up, mentioning North Korean soldiers fighting, as is said, on Ukrainian soil, you know, the Iranians, the Chinese, supporting that war, financing, bringing weapons. Is this the autocracy Inc. that you are talking about? You know, a collaboration of autocracies to fight via one means against the whole West?
Yes. I mean, actually, I think we've been in a form of war for a long time. There is firstly a war of ideas. There is an idea, you know, of liberal democracy that is being challenged in different ways, both internally and externally, and sometimes they work together. There is a geopolitical competition. There is Ukraine is just the kinetic war. Ukraine is the war that you see. But the war exists in other places as well, and in other forms. And so, yes, absolutely. I mean, in a way, the North Korean role in the war is pretty extraordinary, because, you know, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's any historic bad relationship between North Korea and Ukraine. I mean, they don't exist in the same sphere. They're not there's no Ukrainian Korean anger based on something that happened 1,000 years ago. I mean, there's no reason for it. The only reason for the North Koreans to be involved in this war is, first of all, financial, because this autocracy, Inc., is knit together partly for financial reasons, and we have to assume Putin is paying for these soldiers and for the ammunition. But also, as I said, it's ideological. I mean, the North Koreans support the idea of dictatorship. They want dictatorships to defeat, to have a defeat against the liberal democratic world, and so and I assume they're there for that reason as well. So yes, in that sense, it's already an international conflict.
What is the goal of China? Happily marching along on a road to a new world order without order?
I think China wants Putin's Russia, to survive, but to be weak enough to subdue itself to Chinese interests. And this is, in my view, the strategy that China is entertaining in a more kind of Chinese philosophy style. They're sitting on the bank of the river and watching just whose corpse will flow by. But they have a strategy. They have a strategy of taking over the United States as the #1 superpower in the world, and every decision they make is subject to achieving this goal.
And a question of making Russia dependent?
Of course. The weaker, this is their logic, the weaker Russia is, the more China benefits from Russia. But if Putin's Russia ceases to exist, it will weaken China. Because they want Putin's Russia because they know him. They know how to work with him, and it works. And they slowly bite one piece of Russian potential and resources after another, and they make it more dependent on them. Of course, officially, they will not recognize, this is not the official rhetoric in the Chinese foreign policy or their relations with Moscow, but this is essentially what is happening.
I mentioned in the beginning your podcast with Pomerantsev about autocracy in America. I mean, that's another angle. I was fascinated because of all the examples that you found for autocracy as you define it already, like getting a grasp. I mean, obviously the name is Trump that we have to talk about, but obviously not only. So what is it that you find in America that makes you very nervous ahead of the elections as well, when it comes to these anti-democratic changes?
Well, I mean, look, there is an autocratic tradition and autocratic tendencies in America like there is in every other country. Yeah. And it's manifested itself at different times in different ways. I mean, what was the Confederacy? There's a long. We have one of our episodes was about Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana in the 1930s, who essentially did in Louisiana what Viktor Orban did in Hungary. Kind of captured the institutions of the state and politicized them and made them work for him. I mean, it wasn't of world historical significance because it was Louisiana. Although he did run for president, and had he not been assassinated, which he was, maybe he would have. Some of his ideas would appeal. So I don't think people should be shocked or surprised by the emergence of a movement which is skeptical of the idea of rights, which is skeptical of separation of powers, which seeks a kind of unity of government, because it's, as I said, it's always been there, and you can find it everywhere else as well. It's just that the form of American liberal democracy that we've known at least since the Second World War is one, was so successful and made America so prosperous and made it such a great leader that I think the idea that there could be an alternative was one we forgot about.
It always looked invincible.
But it's been there. You can find it in American history going back to the beginning.
Okay, but how will the fate of Ukraine change if Trump wins this election?
To be honest, I don't know.
Okay.
Because Trump, he says this thing about ending the war in one day, and literally Around him, there are 5 or 6 people who have different interpretations of what that means, and can tell you at different times. I mean, either it means we cut off support, or it means that we quadruple support and we threaten the Russians and we make. I mean, I won't go into all the details. I mean, but there are different versions of it. I don't think Trump himself knows what it means, and I think he will decide. In the light of, he's somebody who is a politician who thinks mostly about himself. So what is good for him and what's good for his power, his money, maybe his friends and family. He's not interested either in the well-being of Americans or the well-being of Ukrainians or the well-being of Russians. And so he will determine in the light of circumstances what's best for him, and then he'll act that way. And that means that I can't predict it.
What's your take on that? Are you scared? Sorry. I thought you might.
You can't ask Ukrainians if they're scared. I mean, what is...
I take that question back. Okay.
The biggest difference between a person who lives in peace and who lives in war is that the person in peace believes that the worst thing will never happen to him specifically, or her. The person that lives at war believes that anything can happen to him or her at any given moment. So I realized when some Europeans or Americans are watching the war in Ukraine and they say they sympathize, they say they try to be helpful, but they do not believe that this can happen on their streets with the people they love, because it's somewhere there. We did not believe it would happen to us the way it is happening now. I mean, I personally believed that there would be a war, but if you ask me whether I could imagine Russian ballistic missiles flying all over Ukraine, no, that was too far. So first, everyone in any part of the world should believe that anything bad or good, usually bad unfortunately, can happen. And that's when you begin to believe in that, you adapt yourself. The way you think, the way you take decisions becomes completely different, because you know that you have to survive whatever happens. So if Trump gets elected, we will have to survive under the new reality. If Kamala Harris gets elected, we know how the reality will also change. It will change, by the way. I don't think it will be exactly the same as the Biden administration. But I don't want to sound boring by echoing Anne again, but I agree with her. The main thing that you have to know about Trump, President Trump, as far as we know him, is that he doesn't like Ukraine. But if supporting Ukraine will be good for him personally, he will support Ukraine. And the task is to do the policy in a way when he will be making decisions in favor of Ukraine, realizing that this is something that he personally benefits from, as it was the case in some cases during his first tenure as the president, as it was the case with the passing of the supplemental, when he literally gave green light to vote it in the House. So whatever happens, we will survive.
I would never dare to repeat the question whether the Ukrainians are afraid, but what I want to ask nevertheless is, when I was in Kiev 2 years ago, everybody was enthusiastic because it looked like Ukraine was winning. A year ago, the enthusiasm had already diminished. Now the situation is quite bleak, and the winter is coming, and everybody is depressed and frustrated. That's how you would probably say it's different, but that's what I saw when I was in Kharkiv and Dnipro during the last weeks. And with what's happening in Europe, with what's happening in the United States, at least the way the Ukrainians look at Europe, at the EU, at NATO, where they want to join, the door is closed, they want to be members of the EU, but they kind of let them stand in the rain. So it changes the positive outlook of Ukraine on the West, and at the same time it diminishes some of the interior strength. Is that at least right?
Well, fight the war, the devastating large-scale war, the largest since Second World War in Europe for 2 years and a half, and I want to see how people will feel about that. Of course we are tired, of course we are bleak, but we understand what is at stake, and this is why you have to wake up every morning and just do your job. Whatever you can do, you have to be helpful. Is it like 100% Ukrainians who follow that rule? Probably not, because every society is very different. But do we have the country that is alive and kicking against a much stronger enemy for the 2.5 years with big but still insufficient support from friends? Yes, and I think we should be proud of that. And instead of getting depressed of the fact that we feel exhausted, we have to be inspired that we have done so much, and we keep our resistance. Mainly because we know our history very well, and that will bring me to the answer to your question. Do Ukrainians feel disappointed about the West? This is the West that we have. We don't have another West. And we are trying to help you, to cheer you up, to say, guys, you are good, you are strong, believe in yourself. Unfortunately, I'm not a deputy minister anymore, so.
Now you can speak completely openly.
Unfortunately, in Europe, I see many people, intellectuals, politicians, drowning in endless self-criticism and destroying confidence in what you stand for and what you fought for. And sometimes it doesn't mean how tired we are, how bleak we feel. We also have to find that energy inside of us to come and say, guys, everything is going to be fine, just do something.
Thank you for coming. 2 more questions before we finish. One to you. That support that Ukraine needs should have come from international organizations, which are kind of defunct when we look at the UN. The reform talks are going on. Will they lead anywhere, or does Ukraine have to live with the UN as it is as well, not only with the West?
So I actually don't think that the UN system as it now is reformable.
Yeah,
I don't think it can be reformed.
Great.
There are pieces of the UN that still function. Yep. They're very important aid agencies. I'm not going to abolish the whole thing overnight. But I don't think that the Security Council, as it now is, with Russia and China as members, yep, both dedicated to the undermining of the democratic world, I don't think it works anymore. In my book, I have a suggestion for a different way to think about international organizations, really to think about coalitions. And it's actually a very 20th century idea, that an international organization means we build a huge building, in New York or in Geneva, and we hire a lot of bureaucrats to work in it, and it has some kind of permanent set of tasks. I think a much more flexible and modern way to think about international organizations is that they should involve coalitions. You could call it a coalition of the willing, to borrow George Bush's terminology. They should be focused on particular tasks. Whether it's pushing back and fighting kleptocracy, whether it's reforming and regulating the internet, whether it's aiding Ukraine, and then you could have a wide range of countries in them. Not all of the countries who are part of the coalition to aid Ukraine, not all of them are democracies. So yeah, there is there's a wide range of countries that could find common interests and could work together. And that's how I would think about international organizations from now on. Okay.
Mr. Kuleba, our topic today was the world after the war in Ukraine. After the war in Ukraine, will there be a united Ukraine, and that's not self-understood, will there be a democratic Ukraine?
Absolutely, because Ukraine will not be able to survive if it ceases to be democracy. We just, by our nature, by our history, and by our geography, we are bound to be a democracy, because it's the only future that we have. So, but again, you know, I noticed one thing. We were discussing that politicians are not ending the sentence as long as it takes, but we do the same thing when we say when the war ends, what is going to happen with the world. We are not saying how the war should end. And I think we should be asking ourselves a question, how the world will look like when Ukraine wins, or how the world will look like if Ukraine loses.
Exactly.
Because this will be two different worlds. And I'm pretty certain that no one in this audience and those who are watching us or will be watching us want to live in a world in which Russia wins.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to have you all here. It was great to have you two here. And I want to end this session with one sentence that I heard from the wonderful Tanya Malyachuk, who I heard about 2 hours ago on another session at the Ukraine stand. She said the wonderful sentence, and I think that's what we should keep in mind. Ukraine is so much more than this war. Thank you very much.